explore the period from Reconstruction through the early 20th century. So from the post-Civil War era to the early 1900s. And this was a time of contradictions for many Americans. A little while ago, we were talking about The Great Gatsby and the Roaring Twenties with some of you as you were going through. And there were people that lived like that as well during this time. We see photographs from them on the left-hand side of the screen. What does this photograph on the left-hand side of the screen look like? What's going on here? Describe this image to me. Okay, it looks like a party. There's a big dinner. How do the people look? Well dressed? White? Do they have any money? Yes. All right, what are some things that tell us that looking at this image? Okay, the clothes that they're wearing. It's very cleaned up, and the dining room is very opulent. All right, what about on the right? This is a photograph from Jacob Riis. Literally, as these people are having this dinner, there are people living in the conditions on the right. What's that? They look very poor. Why do they look poor? Okay. Okay. So how their living conditions look? What about them? How are they dressed? Not so well. Okay. Pretty filthy. Yep. So it's a time of excess and crisis happening simultaneously, happening at the same time. And this particular image was taken by a gentleman named Jacob Riis. Anybody ever hear of Jacob Riis? Okay. In the video, what else? Did you learn about Jacob Riis at all during your stations? Right, the muckraker station, Jacob Riis was the guy that took the photographs to illuminate the plight of the poor. Now, one of the things that was happening as these excesses of the Gilded Age were going on was we had a group of people that we knew as either captains of industry or robber barons. Which of these sounds positive and which sounds negative, Savon? Which sounds positive? Captain of industry or robber baron? Positive. Okay, robber sounds negative. Yep. So captain of industry would be the one with the positive connotation. So captain of industry is a person who is viewed as a good person helming a specific industry. And there were several of these people that did not only good things for the world of business, but also did good things for society. Robber barons were individuals who were often successful, but they didn't necessarily get their success in the best possible manner. They practiced ruthless business practices and did things like forming monopolies and trusts in order to get ahead. Regardless, both of these groups benefited from the excesses of the Gilded Age. They had lavish parties like the one in the photograph left. And while some did give charity to poor, there was still a huge income disparity. The rich were very rich, the poor were very poor. And many of these individuals owned companies that even those that were of the best often exploited workers. Workers in these companies worked long hours for low wages. Particularly women and children were not paid very well. Anybody want to guess what a good hourly wage might have been back then? $3? Yeah, if you were earning like 20 cents an hour, you were making bank back then. 20 cents an hour. Not today. Yeah. Plus tips, right? All right. And additionally, you couldn't complain because you had no job security. So if you were viewed as a troublesome worker, they would just let you loose and you'd lose any income that you had. Most people, particularly women and children, were earning like 5 cents an hour. 10 or 15 cents an hour for men wasn't uncommon. And you also had no benefits. They didn't have health insurance. They didn't have workman's comp. So if you got hurt on the job, guess what? You either went to work injured or you stayed home and likely lost your job and then didn't get any payment in exchange. The working conditions as a whole were incredibly dangerous. The image on the left shows an incident known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire was in a building in New York City where they made shirtwaists, which are basically the parts of the shirt without the arms. And this factory was full of sewing machines and cutters that made these shirts and primarily employed women. And they had problems with theft. Some of the people that worked there, they believed, were stealing the cloth and stealing some of the thread, probably just to help clothe their own families. So they locked doors that led to fire escapes because they thought that's how some of the people were stealing some of the items from the factory. And then one day there was a fire. It's believed that somebody either had a match, a cigarette, or some other type of lantern wick, and it got into a pile of clothing. And the building, as you can see, it's a fairly tall building, caught on fire. And people couldn't get to the fire escape. They could only get down the stairs. And people were crushed trying to escape the building. A lot of people died of smoke inhalation. In total, over 100 people died, and most of them were young women because that was the primary employment base for the factory. And so, yeah, some jumped out the windows. It was quite horrific. And there are photographs that you can find online where the women are literally laid out in the street, like on white sheets, just showing like the mass amount of people that died. And fortunately, because of this incident, many people called for increased workplace safety, particularly in regards to access to fire escapes. And they did expand workplace safety, but it took a really significant tragedy to have that happen. Other factories had poor conditions, poor ventilation. People contracted lung diseases. They were exposed to chemicals. You guys read about a bad working condition in the excerpt from The Jungle. What was going on there? Thomas, you were telling your group about this the other day. What was going on with the meat factory? Yeah, there were rat feces in the food, but what did you catch what happened to the workers? Yeah, they got diseases, and sometimes they would have fingers chopped off and stuff like that, and they'd end up in the meat. Sound pretty tasty, Sid? All right. Oh, hot sauce. Okay, hot sauce makes anything better. All right. So another thing that was happening during this time period was something called a company town. And company towns were places like the Pullman Company, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a future unit. The Pullman Company, they actually built this really nice town for their workers to live in. And how does that sound? If your employer is going to provide you with a place to live and a grocery store to shop in and a school to send your kids to, why does it sound horrible? Okay. So the conditions weren't too bad in the company town, but as Sid said, if you get fired, where do you go? Also, as we're going to see in the next slide, what's going to happen if they cut your wages? Are they going to cut your rent, do you think? Probably not. And so then you're stuck. So one of the things that was done to help combat some of these issues was the formation of labor unions. The goals of labor unions at this time were higher wages, fewer work hours, and safer conditions. Those were the three main goals: higher wages, fewer work hours, and safer conditions. And 4 main organizations were founded at this time to help make these things a reality. The first was a group called the Knights of Labor, and their key leader was a gentleman by the name of Terence Powderly. If you ever see a picture of Terence Powderly, I don't have one up here, but he had a really fancy handlebar mustache. Terence Powderly, you're looking a picture up. Terence Powderly was a great leader for the Knights of Labor, but as we're going to see in a moment, they got caught up in a pretty unfortunate situation with a strike. Then we have the American Federation of Labor, which at that time was led by a gentleman by the name of Samuel Gompers. He's pretty handsome, Neil, huh? He does kind of look like Mr. Torty. And then the AFL, as the American Federation of Labor was known as, is still around today. Have any of you guys ever heard of the AFL-CIO? Maybe? No? Virginia is not a big union state, but that's one of the biggest labor unions in the world that still exists today. Then we also have the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs. Debs was a pretty interesting guy. He ran for president, I think, at least 4 times. And one of the times that he ran for president, he was running for president from jail because he was arrested for striking, letting a strike get out of control. And he actually ran as a socialist candidate for president from jail and got votes. And then the last one's the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. All right, so strikes. You guys have heard conversation about walkouts in the news recently. Strikes were basically walkouts by workers. They wanted to ensure that the place of business where they worked could not function. And so everybody walked out of the factory and said, we are not going back to work until you meet our demands. Anybody know of a big strike that's happening in our country right now? Anybody watching the news? Bingo. Yeah. In West Virginia, yep. So there's a big teacher strike going on in West Virginia. Teachers in West Virginia are pretty significantly underpaid. They also don't have very good benefits. And so their teachers union, it's a statewide organization, is leading a strike. And so they're now, today is their 8th day of school, I think, without having classes. And so obviously that's an inconvenience not only to the school system, but to the parents and to the students. And so they're hopeful that they'll be able to come to some type of agreement this week. But one of the very first strikes that I want you guys to know is the Haymarket Square riot. And unfortunately, this strike led to the demise of the Knights of Labor. What happened is this strike happened in Chicago at a McCormick Reaper factory. So Cyrus McCormick from Rafine moved to Chicago to start the McCormick Reaper factory, which would ultimately become known as International Harvester. And at this factory, the workers felt like they were being underpaid and overworked, so they staged a strike. Unfortunately, another group in the community, a group of anarchists, people who didn't want to have organized government, they got involved in the strike on the periphery, and it led to some violence. And even though the strikers themselves didn't want to be violent, the anarchists were violent, and they actually ended up utilizing bombs, and some people were killed. And so this made the Knights of Labor look really bad because they were the ones who organized the strike. And so unfortunately, the Knights of Labor met their demise as a result of this because of bad publicity. Another major strike during this time was the Homestead strike, which happened at a Carnegie steel plant in Pittsburgh. Andrew Carnegie actually went on vacation to Europe and left his assistant, Henry Frick, in charge. And Henry Frick cut the workers' wages while Carnegie was gone. And the workers striked. And the workers struck. And then they ended up calling in some Pinkerton detectives to allow scabs, who were people who would work in place of the strikers, to get into the factory to work. And the situation got really bad. Another anarchist got involved and actually tried to assassinate Henry Frick. And when Carnegie found that out, he fired all of the striking workers and closed his factories to unions for an indefinite period of time. And then the last one's the Pullman strike. The Pullman Car Company, which Miss Zinn talked to you guys about last week during the vocab, was a company in Chicago that made sleeper cars for railroads, and they had a company town. And Sydney mentioned one of the downsides of a company town, or if you lose your job, you don't have anywhere to go. But if they cut your wages and they don't cut your rent, you're also going to have problems. And so the Pullman Car Company, in order to save money during an economic depression, they cut wages, but they kept the rent and the food the same prices. And people were very unhappy, so they went on strike. And President Grover Cleveland got involved, and he actually hitched mail cars to the Pullman cars. So why would he do that in order to make the Pullman cars move? Why would hooking up a mail car? Mail has to be delivered, and interfering with the mail is a federal offense. So then they could arrest the strikers, including Eugene Debs of the American Railway Union, for hampering the delivery of mail. And that's how they ended that particular strike. But even though the strikes had their limited successes at those points in time, over the long term, they did manage to limit work hours and also regulate working conditions. So things did improve. Now, the progressive movement also sought to reform the economic, political, and social systems of the United States through both government regulation and oversight. And you saw some examples of those things, as Haley mentioned, as you circulated around from table to table. Yes. All right. Now, why does all of this happen? Well, the progressive movement had several causes. Economic exploitation. So one of the causes of the progressive movement was economic exploitation. As we talked about before, some of these industrialists formed trusts and monopolies to gain money in kind of unscrupulous ways. They also exploited natural resources in our environment, as well as the humans that worked for them. There was also political corruption, particularly in small cities. They formed political machines that, while they did perform services for people and while they did help people, they also took significant advantage of those people. And then social injustice, child labor, living conditions. People needed consumer protection, and they also sought racial, gender, and ethnic equality. So the three goals in the end of the progressive movement were to increase economic opportunity, to increase democracy, and to increase social justice. So those are the three goals: increase economic opportunity, increase democracy, and increase social justice. Some of these movements were led by muckrakers. And some significant muckrakers for this time period you looked at in Station 4. And a muckraker was a progressive whose investigative literature exposed abuses in economics, politics, and society. Ida Tarbell targeted John Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. As a young girl, she had to experience Rockefeller running her father and his business partner out of business in Western Pennsylvania. And her father's business partner committed suicide because he was so despondent over the loss of his business. And for the rest of her life, Tarbell blamed Rockefeller for her father's sadness over the loss of his business partner. And her work, which was called A History of Standard Oil Company, led to some significant antitrust legislation. Lincoln Steffens, he wrote a piece called The Shame of the Cities, where he targeted corruption in local governments and also encouraged all citizens to get involved in government and not to be apathetic. And then lastly, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, exposed not only the ickiness of the meatpacking industry in Chicago at that time, but also the poor situation of immigrants. And it was also a book that espoused the practice of socialism, because Sinclair was a socialist and he felt that that would help to increase the quality of life for some of the immigrants in this nation. All right, so progressive accomplishments. In local governments, new forms of government were created, including the commissioner style and city manager style, in order to meet the increasing needs of urbanization, growing cities. The commissioner style of government, if you've ever done anything with like Batman comics or watched any of the Batman movies, they illustrate the commissioner style system of New York City. So you have a police commissioner, you have a city commissioner, you have a mayor, you have a public works commissioner, and all of those people head up specific portions of the city. This little city called Stanton, Virginia, actually originated the city manager style of government. And this style of government places a city manager, in our case, presently Steve Owen, in a position to oversee the daily running of the city. 3 of your vocab words are in the next section: initiative, referendum, recall, and secret ballot. Make sure you jot these down before we leave today. We'll pick up with this tomorrow and finish out our lecture then. Anybody